Hey everyone, tomorrow's a special day. It's my birthday. I wanted to take this chance to celebrate with all of you, my amazing community. Your support means the world to me, and every comment, like, and share makes my day brighter. If you'd like to send a little birthday cheer or gift, you can do so through PayPal. Thank you all for being a part of Whispers in the Dark. Let's make this next year even spookier and more exciting together. There's a place in the heart of rural Maine, known by locals as the Blackstone House. Although it's been abandoned for decades, those who grew up nearby remember the dark stories whispered among friends about what happened there. Many say the house itself is alive, haunted by memories of tragic events and eerie sightings of shadows moving past the windows. Maggie Hayes had heard the rumors since she was a kid, but never believed them. She thought of them as campfire stories to frighten children, something teenagers made up to scare each other on Halloween. That was until she was hired to survey the property as part of a development project. When Maggie arrived, the house stood silent and looming, a massive Victorian structure hidden by creeping vines and overshadowed by dead, leafless trees. She took her camera and flashlight, ignoring the unsettled feeling creeping up her spine. As Maggie explored the house, it became clear it wasn't as empty as it seemed. Each step she took echoed through the walls, but every now and then she'd hear a faint echo, almost like someone walking just a step behind her. She stopped, listening. Silence. And then, just as she was about to write it off as her imagination, a sharp whisper cut through the air. "Leave." Maggie spun around, her flashlight darting through the dusty, cluttered hallway. But no one was there. Shivers shot down her spine, yet she pushed herself forward. She was here to do a job, and nothing, not even ghostly whispers, would scare her off. But as she stepped up further in, a door at the end of the hall creaked open on its own, revealing a staircase leading down into darkness. Curiosity got the better of her, and she descended into the basement, her heart pounding. There was a strange smell, metallic, almost like copper, mixed with something rotting. As her flashlight skimmed the walls, she found herself staring at old photos nailed to the wall. They were old, black and white portraits of people, each one looking straight ahead, each with eyes that seemed to follow her every move. And there, in the far corner, she found an old faded picture of a girl who looked exactly like her. Just as she was about to pull the photo from the wall, the light went out. Then came the whisper again, this time right in her ear. "You should never have come here." The basement plunged into darkness, and Maggie's pulse quickened. She shook her flashlight, desperate for it to turn back on. For a moment, the darkness felt like a solid, heavy blanket pressing in on her. She could still smell that strange copper scent mixed with decay, thicker now in the cold, stale air. Then, just as suddenly as it went out, the flashlight flickered back to life, casting an eerie glow across the damp, crumbling walls. The old photo of the girl who looked like her was gone. In its place, an empty nail jutted from the wall. Maggie froze. She could feel a prickle of unease creeping up her spine, a chill that seemed to settle in her bones. The silence around her grew louder, more intense, until she could almost feel the house itself breathing with her. Determined to keep her composure, she whispered to herself, "You're just hearing things. You're alone here." But as she backed toward the stairs, she heard soft, dragging footsteps behind her. The footsteps stopped just as she spun around, her flashlight revealing only empty shadows. But something caught her eye, a flash of movement at the far end of the room. For a moment, she thought it was her reflection, but then she realized that the figure staring back at her was not her reflection. It was someone else entirely. A girl, her skin pale and eyes hollow, her mouth twisted in a silent scream. Maggie stumbled backward, her foot catching on a rotting floorboard as she fell against the wall. The girl vanished in a blink, leaving only a faint imprint burned into Maggie's vision. Heart racing, she bolted up the stairs, desperate to escape the basement. But as she reached the top of the stairs, the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. Maggie banged on the door, panic clawing at her throat, but the wood didn't budge. She could hear whispering again, closer this time, like several voices murmuring just on the other side of the door. "No, no, let me out," she shouted, her voice trembling. But instead of a response, she heard laughter, soft, mocking laughter that sent chills down her spine. And then, as quickly as the laughter began, it stopped. The door slowly creaked open by itself. She staggered back, peering cautiously into the hallway, which was now drenched in a cold blue-gray light that seemed unnatural. Gathering her things, Maggie hurried down the hallway, desperate to leave. But as she reached the front door, she noticed something strange. Where she had originally seen rows of peeling wallpaper, there were now portraits lining the walls, each one depicting a different person, staring out with hollow, desperate eyes. Her heart sank when she noticed that one of the photos was of her, taken only moments ago in the basement. Fear etched across her face. Before she could process this, a voice whispered from behind her, inches from her ear, "Stay." Maggie didn't look back. She yanked open the front door and stumbled outside, feeling the cold evening air hit her like a slap. She ran to her car, her breaths coming in sharp gasps. Fumbling with her keys, she got inside, locked the doors, and sped down the road, leaving the Blackstone house behind. But as she drove away, she glanced in her rearview mirror and froze. In the back seat, she saw the same pale, hollow-eyed girl staring back at her, her face twisted in that same silent scream. Maggie's hands trembled on the steering wheel as she drove back to town, her mind racing with images of the house and the girl who seemed to follow her. Every so often, she'd glance at the back seat, half expecting to see the ghostly figure staring back at her. But each time, she found only empty shadows. As she pulled into her driveway, Maggie forced herself to breathe. She told herself it was just her imagination, that maybe she was just exhausted. But her instincts told her otherwise. That night, sleep was elusive. Every time she closed her eyes, she could hear faint whispers in her room, the same words repeating over and over. "You should never have come here." When she finally drifted off, she was haunted by vivid dreams. She was back in the Blackstone house, only now it was fully furnished, with candles flickering on every windowsill. She heard footsteps coming down the hallway, slow and steady. Her dream self wanted to run, but she was frozen in place, heart pounding as the footsteps drew closer. The door creaked open, and she saw her own reflection staring back at her, hollow-eyed, mouth twisted in that silent scream. She woke with a start, drenched in sweat. The next morning, Maggie was determined to find answers. She drove to the town's local library, where she combed through old newspaper archives and historical records. After a few hours, she stumbled upon an article that made her blood run cold. Blackstone House Tragedy: The Missing Girl and the Vanishing Family. The article recounted a horrific event from 1932, when the Blackstone family had lived in the house. According to the story, their young daughter Lily had vanished without a trace one autumn night. The townspeople had searched for weeks, but no one ever saw her again. Soon after her disappearance, the entire Blackstone family was said to have gone insane, claiming to see Lily's ghost wandering the halls. One by one, they each died under mysterious circumstances. The house had been abandoned ever since. As she read on, Maggie's heart stopped. The article included a photograph of young Lily Blackstone. She was pale, with wide, hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through the camera. She looked identical to the girl Maggie had seen in the house. Maggie felt a chill run down her spine. If this was Lily, was she somehow tied to the house, seeking revenge, or even release? As she thought about the photos she had seen of herself lining the hallway walls, a new fear crept over her. It was as if the house was claiming her, piece by piece. Despite her better judgment, Maggie knew she had to return. She couldn't escape the feeling that if she didn't face Lily's ghost and the horrors of the house, she would be haunted forever. She made a decision. She would go back to the Blackstone house that night, armed with the knowledge she had gained, and confront whatever it was that lurked in those darkened halls. Maggie parked at the edge of the Blackstone house property just as night was falling, the sky a deep, bruised purple. The house loomed like a dark shadow against the horizon, and despite the oppressive fear squeezing her chest, she felt drawn to it, compelled, even. Armed with only a flashlight and an old journal she found at the library, one that detailed the Blackstone family's last days, Maggie took a deep breath and stepped toward the house. The wind howled through the trees, almost as if warning her to turn back, but she was resolute. She wouldn't be haunted any longer. Inside, the air was thick and suffocating, colder than it had been during her first visit. The familiar creaks and whispers began almost immediately, but now Maggie could make out faint words woven into the whispers. Help us. The basement door stood open, a dark maw waiting to swallow her. She stepped inside, descending cautiously into the abyss below. The smell of decay and iron hung in the air, and Maggie's footsteps echoed through the silent space. The flashlight flickered, its beams stretching across the walls, illuminating the faded portraits once more. But this time there were new faces among them, faces of people who had gone missing in the decades after the Blackstone family's tragedy. And there, among the faces, was her own photo once again, looking more faded and distorted than before. Suddenly, she felt a freezing grip around her wrist. She screamed, dropping the flashlight, which rolled across the floor and stopped at the feet of a figure standing in the darkness. It was Lily. The ghostly girl stood before her face hollow and pale, her mouth twisted in that same scream. But as Maggie stared, she saw something else. A sadness, a desperation in Lily's eyes that went beyond hatred. The girl's lips moved, forming words too faint to hear, but Maggie caught the shape of them. Help me. I don't know how, Maggie whispered, trembling, but I'll try. A sudden gust of icy wind swirled around her, pulling her toward the far wall, where an old, rusted door was barely visible in the shadows. Maggie reached out, feeling a shiver of dread, but the words in the journal echoed in her mind. Free the girl, and you'll free them all. She gripped the handle, pulling the door open. The smell hit her immediately, a suffocating wave of decay, like something long dead. Behind the door was a tiny room, barely large enough to stand in. In the center of the room, a small wooden box lay on the floor, covered in dust. It was old, its wood warped with time, but as she bent down, she could see faint initials carved into the lid. LB. She lifted the lid, revealing a tattered doll and a single lock of hair tied with a faded pink ribbon. As her hand brushed the doll, she felt an overwhelming sorrow, like years of grief pressing down on her, flooding her mind with memories that weren't her own. She could see the young Lily, hiding in this dark room, scared and alone, waiting for her family to come find her. But no one ever did. A soft sob echoed in the room, and Maggie looked up to see Lily's ghost standing at the doorway, her hollow eyes staring at the box. I'm sorry, Maggie whispered. I'm so sorry. For a moment, the room fell silent. Then Lily's expression softened, her hollow eyes filling with something like peace. She slowly faded, leaving only a cold, lingering chill in the air. Maggie took a deep breath, closing the box carefully. She knew now that the girl's spirit had been trapped in this house, seeking release from the endless torment. She turned to leave, but as she reached the basement stairs, a familiar voice whispered one last time, "Thank you." When Maggie finally stepped out into the night, the house seemed quieter, the oppressive weight gone. She felt a deep, satisfying peace settle over her. The haunting was over, or so she thought. As she climbed into her car, her phone buzzed with a notification. She opened it, heart skipping a beat. It was a photograph taken just moments ago. It showed the Blackstone House, standing silently under the moonlight. And there, in one of the windows, she saw the unmistakable face of Lily Blackstone, watching her go. Maggie drove away from the Blackstone House, convinced she had finally laid Lily's spirit to rest. But that night, as she tried to sleep, she couldn't shake the image of Lily's face in the window, watching her leave. The photograph on her phone felt like a warning, a message from the beyond that she wasn't free just yet. The next morning, she awoke to a strange sensation. Her bedroom felt colder than usual, and a faint odor like decayed wood and dust lingered in the air. As she climbed out of bed, she noticed something odd. A single, child-sized footprint on her bedroom floor, smeared faintly in dirt. Her heart skipped a beat, and her breath came in shallow gasps. She couldn't explain how it got there, but it was unmistakable. A small, pale footprint, as if someone had been standing beside her bed during the night. Trying to shake off the unease, she left the house to clear her mind, but things only grew stranger. Her car's radio flickered on by itself, static hissing through the speakers. She reached to turn it off, but a faint voice emerged from the static, one that made her blood run cold. "Help me." Maggie slammed the radio off, her heart pounding. She reminded herself that it was probably just an equipment glitch, but deep down, she knew there was something more. Whatever spirit had haunted the Blackstone house hadn't left. It had followed her home. Desperate for answers, Maggie went back to the library, digging deeper into the Blackstone family's past. She found another article, one that sent chills through her veins. Mysterious deaths linked to Blackstone House. Is the haunting spreading? The article detailed the strange experiences of those who had lived near or visited the house over the years. One man had developed vivid, unshakable nightmares of being trapped in a small, dark room. A woman claimed to have seen the face of a young girl in her mirror, watching her with hollow eyes. Many had died mysteriously within weeks of their visit, and every account ended with a similar note. The haunting, it follows. Maggie's heart sank. She realized that the house didn't just trap Lily's spirit, it had a dark influence that latched onto anyone who dared to confront it. By opening the box and connecting with Lily's spirit, she might have become its newest target. When she returned home that evening, the signs of the haunting grew worse. As she entered her living room, she found small, dusty handprints on her mirror, as if a child had pressed their palms against it. The air grew heavy and cold, filled with whispers that she could barely understand. Just when she thought she was losing her mind, her phone buzzed again. It was another photo, but this time it wasn't of the Blackstone house. It was her own bedroom. And there, standing in the shadows by her bed, was the faint outline of a young girl with hollow eyes and a twisted mouth, staring directly at the camera. Maggie's hands shook as she dropped the phone. She knew she couldn't stay here, but running didn't feel like an option either. She had to confront whatever this was before it consumed her completely. Summoning all her courage, Maggie whispered, "Lily, if you're here, show me what you want." The air grew icy, and a faint voice echoed through the room, just above a whisper, as if carried by the wind. "You're like me now, you can never leave." And then, one by one, the lights flickered out, plunging her home into total darkness. Maggie sat in her darkened living room, heart pounding as Lily's final words echoed in her mind. "You're like me now. You can never leave." The realization hit her. She was bound to the Blackstone house, just as Lily had been, and the ghostly girl wasn't the only thing haunting her. She had unwittingly brought the curse back with her, and now her home felt like an extension of the dark, decaying house. She knew that if she didn't act quickly, she could be trapped forever. Desperate, Maggie reached out to an old friend, Lucas, who had studied folklore and paranormal rituals. He was skeptical at first, but after hearing Maggie's trembling voice and the terror behind her words, he agreed to help. They met at her house, where she showed him the photos, the footprints, and the handprints scattered throughout her home. Lucas's face went pale as he examined the evidence. "This is a classic case of a residual haunting, but it's stronger than anything I've ever read about. The Blackstone house, it's using Lily's spirit to spread its curse, and now that you've connected with it, it's latched onto you." "What can we do?" Maggie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's only one way to break a curse like this," Lucas said, looking at her with grim determination. "You have to confront the source. Go back to the Blackstone house and perform a ritual to release the spirits tied to it. It'll be dangerous, but it's the only way to free yourself." Maggie knew the risks, but fear of the alternative drove her forward. That night, she and Lucas gathered the materials needed for the ritual: a silver mirror, a handful of salt, and a candle. With trembling hands, she packed the items and set out for the Blackstone house once again. The house stood ominous against the night sky, its dark windows like hollow eyes watching her approach. As they entered, the familiar suffocating cold wrapped around her, stronger than ever, as if the house itself was resisting her presence. In the main hall, Lucas set up the ritual circle, placing the mirror in the center. "Once we start, there's no turning back," he warned. "We're going to summon Lily's spirit and try to release her and any others trapped here before the house consumes them completely." Maggie nodded, taking a deep breath to steady herself. She struck a match and lit the candle, the small flame flickering as shadows danced across the walls. She sprinkled salt around the circle, whispering the incantation Lucas had taught her, calling forth any spirit tied to the house. The room grew colder, and an oppressive silence fell over them. Then a faint whisper broke the stillness. "Help me." It was Lily. Maggie's heart pounded as she saw the ghostly figure of the young girl materialize within the circle, her hollow eyes filled with sadness and desperation. Maggie held the mirror up, pointing it toward the apparition, as Lucas began the final chant to sever the connection. But as the chant grew louder, the house fought back. Shadows rippled along the walls, and a low, guttural growl echoed through the hall. The portraits on the walls seemed to shift, their faces contorting in pain and rage. The floor trembled beneath them, and Maggie could feel the house itself tightening its grip. Suddenly, Lily's ghostly form lunged forward, her face twisted in agony as she screamed, "It won't let me go." The candle's flame flickered violently, threatening to extinguish, but Maggie held steady, pouring every ounce of strength she had into the ritual. She focused on Lily's face, ignoring the chaos around her. "Lily!" Maggie shouted over the roar. "You don't belong here. It's time to let go." The mirror trembled in her hands, catching the flicker of Lily's form, which seemed to fade in and out like a dying flame. With one final chant, Lucas poured salt onto the mirror, and a blinding flash filled the room. When the light faded, Lily's ghost was gone. The oppressive air lifted, and the room fell silent, as if the house itself had taken a breath and exhaled for the first time in decades. Maggie and Lucas stood in stunned silence, the weight of the ritual lifting. She looked around, realizing that the house felt empty. For the first time, she didn't feel watched or suffocated. But as they left the Blackstone house and locked the door behind them, Maggie glanced back one last time. In a top window, barely visible, she saw Lily's face one last time, not filled with fear, but with peace. Maggie knew she was free, or so she thought.